This is Chapter 11, Part 2. This section of the chapter is all on water pollution. Water pollution is any change in water quality that harms humans or other living organisms or makes water unsuitable for human uses such as drinking, irrigation, and recreation. Agricultural activities are the leading cause of water pollution, and that includes sediment from soil erosion, fertilizers and pesticides, bacteria from livestock and food processing wastes, and excess salts from soils of irrigated cropland. Industrial facilities is a second major source of water pollution, and that includes harmful inorganic and organic chemicals. And mining is the third biggest source of water pollution. Surface mining disturbs the land by creating major erosion of sediments and runoff of toxic chemicals. And according to the World Health Organization, an estimated 4,400 people die each day from preventable infectious diseases that they get from drinking contaminated water. This is a list of major water pollutants, their harmful effects, and the sources. So you see on the left, it shows you the various type of water pollution, heavy metals, things like that, infectious agents, and then it gives you the examples in the middle column, and then the sources is on the right column. So you could read through that. Now, when pollution gets into bodies of water, you have rivers or streams, which is the same thing as rivers, can recover rapidly actually from moderate levels of wastes, as long as the wastes are biodegradable. And the recovery from the pollution entering rivers includes a combination of dilution and biodegradation. So the biodegradation occurs from bacteria breaking down the waste. And keep in mind, we discussed on a previous time that biodegradation of certain wastes uses up oxygen. Dilution is when something has water added to it, so it gets diluted. So the natural recovery process of streams that get polluted does not work when the streams are overloaded with the pollution or when water levels are low. And water levels can be low due to drought or damming of the rivers, which we talked about last class. And again, the waste has to be biodegradable, otherwise the recovery will not happen. So during this type of recovery process in a river, you have something called the oxygen Sag Curve. And that again is because the breakdown of the biodegradable wastes in the stream by bacteria depletes dissolved oxygen. So downstream from a point source of pollution, you're going to have a lag in your oxygen, or a sag in oxygen in this case. And the point source of the pollution could be, let's say, a sewage pipe. And then further downstream, the pollution becomes diluted and dissolved oxygen levels are going to increase further downstream. So we can look at this page right here. It shows the oxygen Sag curve in blue and the oxygen demand curve in red. So on the left, it shows biochemical oxygen demand in red. That is the amount of oxygen demanded by the organisms that live in the water. And then in blue, it's the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. And then all the way on top, it says types of organisms. And then here you have a point source of some sort of sewage pipe causing sewage to go directly into the river. So just underneath the sewage pipe, it says pollution-tolerant fishes, including carp and a fish called gar. And then, by the way, look at the arrow. The arrow is pointing towards the right of the page. So then a little bit further downstream, it says fish are absent, and you have fungus, you have sludge worms, and bacteria, which are anaerobic. In this case, this is your septic zone. Okay, and that is where your dissolved oxygen is the lowest. So that is your oxygen sag. And that's because the bacteria are using up oxygen in the decomposition process. And because you have a lack of oxygen, you're not going to have fish living there. And then further downstream, you have the pollution-tolerant fish live again. And then further downstream, even more, is normal clean water organisms. Trout, perch, bass, for example. And this also shows you the demand in the red line again. So you have a high demand for oxygen where you have the pollution. And that's because of the biodegradation. Bacteria are using up oxygen in the degradation process. So the demand for oxygen is high. So then in 1972, we had the passing of the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act greatly increased the number and quality of plants that treat wastewater. And that wastewater is water that contains sewage and other wastes from homes and industries. And the Clean Water Act was for the United States and in most other more developed countries. Laws also require industries to reduce or eliminate their point source discharges of harmful chemicals into surface waters. And here is a major example of what could happen when you don't have a Clean Water Act. So this is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio. And on June 22nd, 1969, an oil slick and debris in the river caught fire. So the river caught fire. And this brought the attention to other environmental problems across the country. And it helped spur the environmental movement and helped lead to the passage of the Clean Water Act. And actually, there had been fires previously on this river before 1969. And then we're going to just go into river pollution in less developed countries. In most less developed countries, stream pollution is a serious and growing problem. And the sources of that pollution includes discharges of untreated sewage, industrial wastes, and discarded trash. According to the World Commission on Water in the 21st century, half of the world's 500 major rivers are heavily polluted, and most of them run through less developed countries. So here is a river in China, and it's highly polluted. It's in central China, and the water is greenish black due to the pollution, and the pollution mainly is coming from thousands of factories. And 54 of the 78 rivers that are monitored are polluted by industrial wastes and sewage. In some rivers in China, the water is actually too toxic to even touch. And in some cases, you have huge islands of trash up to 2 feet deep. Now, we could also think about how this river pollution in China relates to our lifestyle here in the US. And when you look around you, you might have a lot of products that you find that say made in China. So many of the products that we purchase are made in these factories in China that may have contributed to the pollution. So if you take a minute and look around, perhaps the pen that you're using to write with might say made in China, or the notebook that you might be using, various items around you might say made in China. And they're made in these factories. Okay, so we discussed streams and stream pollution, but what about lakes and reservoirs? So lakes and reservoirs are vulnerable to water pollution. They're less effective at diluting pollutants than streams, and that's due to a lack of the mixing and the water current or water flow. So lakes and reservoirs, the water's pretty stagnant, whereas in a river, the river water moves around. There's a current, so it's able to mix and dilute the pollution better in a stream than in a stagnant lake. Lakes and reservoirs are more vulnerable than streams to contamination also by runoff or discharge of plant nutrients from fertilizers, oil, pesticides, and other toxic and other substances, including non-degradable toxic substances like lead, mercury, and arsenic. You also have atmospheric deposition, for example, mercury, which can lead to pollution being added to lakes. Then we have eutrophication, and we did discuss this in a previous lecture. Eutrophication is when a lake, an estuary, or a stream becomes enriched in nutrients. So eutrophication is when you have a lot of nutrients in surface water. Now, cultural eutrophication is when human activities greatly accelerate the input of the plant nutrients to the lake. And that's usually because the lake or whatever other body of water you're looking at is located near an urban or an agricultural area. So activities that add plant nutrients to bodies of water, including lakes, are going to be wastes that contain nitrates and phosphates. And those come from different sources like farmland, agricultural runoff that has fertilizer in it, animal feedlots, urban streets and parking lots, chemically fertilized lawns in suburban areas, mining sites, for example, in areas where they're mining for phosphates, municipal treatment plants, atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, and phosphorus. Phosphorus containing detergents used to cause eutrophication, but now detergents are generally phosphate free. So that's why that one's in parentheses, because it used to be a major problem in this country. It might still be a problem in countries where they do not have phosphate-free detergents, though. So during hot weather or drought, the nutrient overload can lead to blooms of organisms like an algae bloom or a cyanobacteria bloom. Also, thick growths of aquatic plants like duckweed or water hyacinth. And there were negative consequences of cultural eutrophication. For example, it could lead to the reduction of sunlight, and then you would have an issue because the amount of sunlight penetrating into the water needed for photosynthesis by phytoplankton that the fish eat is all going to be affected. Also, you have a lowering of oxygen content. And that's because the algae will die eventually, and then aerobic bacteria decompose the algae, which depletes dissolved oxygen in the water. Then the low oxygen levels can end up killing fish and other aerobic aquatic animals, and that would be called a fish kill. Anaerobic bacteria could take over and produce gaseous products such as smelly, highly toxic hydrogen sulfide and methane, which is flammable. And this is a lake in China that has been covered with algae due to severe cultural eutrophication. About 1/3 of the 100,000 medium to large lakes and about 85% of the large lakes near major US population centers have some degree of cultural eutrophication. Some ways to prevent or reduce the cultural eutrophication is to have advanced waste treatment to remove nitrates and phosphates before wastewater enters lakes, banning or limiting the use of phosphates in detergents and other cleaning agents, and employ soil conservation and land use control to reduce nutrient runoff and decrease soil erosion from farms. There are ways to clean up lakes that have been affected by cultural eutrophication. We could mechanically remove excess weeds, control plant growth with herbicides and algicides, and you can also pump air through lakes and reservoirs to prevent oxygen depletion. And that's similar to how some people with fish tanks might add oxygen. There's like a little pump that you put into a fish tank and it blows air into the water. It's like little air bubbles will form in the water, and that adds oxygen. So, I mean, we can do that on a larger scale to pump air and add oxygen back into bodies of water that have been affected by cultural eutrophication. Okay, so now what about groundwater? Groundwater pollution is a serious threat to human health. Common pollutants include fertilizers, pesticides, gasoline, and organic solvents. These can all seep into groundwater. When groundwater becomes contaminated, it cannot cleanse itself of degradable wastes as quickly as, let's say, in the river. And that's because it flows slowly, so the contaminants are not going to become diluted and dispersed effectively. Excuse me. So some sources of groundwater contamination include sewage, landfills, toxic waste disposal sites, agricultural, and natural contamination. And again, once pollution is in groundwater, it spreads and it becomes difficult to contain it. And this chart shows you principal sources of groundwater contamination in the US. You could look over this diagram. It could take decades to thousands of years for contaminated groundwater to cleanse itself of slowly degradable wastes. But non-degradable wastes may remain in the groundwater permanently. In the US, an EPA survey of 26,000 industrial waste ponds and lagoons found that 1/3 of them had no liners to prevent toxic liquid waste from seeping into underground aquifers. Almost 2/3 of America's liquid hazardous waste are injected into the ground in disposal wells, some of which leak water into aquifers used as sources of drinking water. By 2008, the EPA had completed the cleanup of about 357,000 of 479,000 underground tanks in the US, that were leaking gasoline, diesel fuel, home heating oil, or toxic solvents into groundwater. And I put this note here, Erin Brockovich, because it was a movie about toxic chemicals getting into groundwater, drinking water. So you could watch that movie if you have some time. During this century, scientists expect many of the millions of such tanks around the world to become corroded and leaky, possibly contaminating groundwater and becoming a major global health problem. Determining the extent of a leak from a single underground tank can cost a lot of money, and the cleanup costs are very high as well. If chemicals reach an aquifer, it sometimes not going to be able to be cleaned up because it may be too costly or it may not even be possible. Then we have natural groundwater contamination. For example, there was arsenic in sediments in parts of India and Bangladesh that have led to groundwater contamination. Arsenic is also an issue in some areas of New England, and the arsenic leaches out from igneous bedrock there. Pollution prevention is the only effective way to protect groundwater. And we could find substitutes for toxic chemicals, keep toxic chemicals out of the environment, install monitoring wells near landfills and underground tanks, require leak detectors on underground tanks, ban hazardous waste disposal in landfills and injection wells, store harmful liquids in above ground tanks with leak detection and collection systems. And here is a chart that shows you groundwater pollution prevention and cleanup. So you could read through that. There are simple measures that can be used to purify drinking water in developing nations where they may be without access to clean water. Now, you can expose a clear plastic bottle filled with contaminated water to intense sunlight, and that can help kill infectious microbes in as little as 3 hours. Now, ultraviolet light can also be used to purify water, and that's going to be shown in the movie Flow, which I'll show you a link on Blackboard for that. Then in this photo, you have something called a life straw. It's an inexpensive water filter that eliminates many viruses and parasites from water that you sip up into the straw. And pathogens can cause cholera, dysentery, typhoid, things like that. Those are waterborne diseases that people could get. So this life straw is very important for people who live in areas where they may not have access to clean water. Also, you can put iodine pills in water, which kills pathogens as well. But these are all ways of killing pathogens. They're not ways of filtering out pollution. Just going back for a second, what I mean by that is the UV light and the iodine pills is not getting rid of any pollution that might be in the water. Okay, something like a filter is going to help more, but just killing the pathogens so that you don't have people getting sick and dying from waterborne illnesses, that's a separate issue from the pollution. Okay, so then we have ocean pollution. Ocean pollution is a significant problem in coastal areas, especially wetlands, estuaries, coral reefs, and mangrove swamps. So the coastal areas is going to be the main areas of the ocean where you have the inputs of pollution and wastes going into the ocean. And that's because the pollutants are coming off of the land. So the coastal areas are going to be more affected. 80 to 90% of municipal sewage from most coastal areas of less developed countries, and in some coastal areas of more developed countries, is dumped into oceans without being treated. Some US coastal waters have found vast colonies of viruses thriving in raw sewage and in effluents from sewage treatment plants and leaking septic tanks. Also, you have bacteria such as E. coli. And sometimes in the summertime, you'll hear about beaches being closed due to bacteria. The bacteria is usually E. coli. And that comes from sewage. If it rains a lot, you might have sewage coming onto the beaches. And then that brings E. coli with it. So you can look at this link here for more information about that. Now, scientists also point to underreported problem of pollution coming from cruise ships. Also, we have something called algal blooms. So these can be pretty harmful, and they can result from the runoff of sewage and agricultural water. So every year, because of algal blooms, at least 400 oxygen-depleted zones form in coastal waters around the world. And some of the algae is actually toxic, and that's what we call toxic red tides. And I have these two videos here of examples of these toxic red tides. Another problem with ocean pollution, another source is microbeads from cosmetics. That includes little tiny beads in face scrubs or body washes and things like that. Also, microfiber fragments that come off of microfiber fabric when you do laundry. And that all ends up in the sewer system, and it could potentially enter into the local waterways. And this shows you residential areas, factories, and farms contributing to pollution of coastal waters. So you could read through each little box here. Then we have the ocean garbage patches. And this diagram shows the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean near Hawaii. And it is mainly just plastic garbage that floats in the water. And here is a close-up of a small section of the Pacific Garbage Patch. And you could read more about the garbage patch by going to this link that I have posted down here. And here's a quick video clip that goes into more detail about the garbage patch.
A California research team is just back from a voyage into the Pacific Ocean. They explored what's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's hundreds of miles long and growing. Our Miguel Almaguer has more on what scientists are just now learning.
The nearly 2-month journey took the crew aboard the research vessel Algalita, where few ever travel. An exploration into what's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, 1,000 miles off the coast of California into the middle of the world's largest open ocean.
Less than 1 hour.
This was Captain Charles Moore's 10th trip, and he discovers something he didn't know existed, an island of trash big enough to stand on.
These are one of the most common debris items that we find out here.
Stretching hundreds of miles long, the garbage patch is a vortex of plastic junk and debris swept together by the ocean's currents. Captain Moore says it's double the size of Texas and growing.
It was utterly devastating to me to see the increase be that great.
5 garbage patches have been identified swirling in our oceans, all likely hundreds of years old. This one in the Pacific getting even larger because of tsunami debris from Japan's 2011 quake.
We have bottle caps.
Scientists are now studying how the debris is working its way into our food chain.
Every piece that we collected almost has some sort of nibble mark on it. So we believe that a lot of these organisms, especially these fish, are going to be as toxic
From the shores of Alaska to the beaches of Hawaii, NBC News has tracked tsunami debris and waste from the garbage patch washing ashore. The long-term environmental impact still unknown.
Huge swaths of the ocean are completely trashed because those areas are remote. They're not part of the conversation. We need to make them part of the conversation.
With the crew of the Algalita back on shore, tonight their research is just beginning. But what they have already discovered is just the first wave of troubling news. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News, Los Angeles.
And then here is another video clip. I'm not going to show you this one too. You could watch this one on your own. Then we have ocean pollution from oil. And crude and refined petroleum reach the ocean from a number of sources. So we have point sources from oil tanker accidents and blowouts at offshore oil drilling rigs. We're going to talk more about that during chapter 13. The largest source of ocean pollution is urban and industrial runoff from land, much of it from leaks in pipelines and oil handling facilities. And that would all be non-point sources unless you could actually find a particular pipeline and a particular leak, then that would be a point source. At least 37% of the oil reaching the oceans is waste oil dumped, spilled, or leaked onto the land or into sewers by cities and industries, as well as by people changing their own motor oil. And the different components of the petroleum are harmful to wildlife, including volatile organic hydrocarbons in the oil and other petroleum products that contain the organic hydrocarbons as well, could kill many aquatic organisms immediately upon contact. Other chemicals in oil form tar-like globs that float on the surface of the water, and they could coat the feathers of seabirds and the fur of marine mammals. And then that actually destroys their natural heat insulation and buoyancy, and then the animals can drown or die of exposure from loss of body heat. And here is a picture of a bird that is covered in oil. Heavy oil components that sink to the ocean floor or wash into estuaries and coastal wetlands can also smother bottom-dwelling organisms. That would include crabs, oysters, mussels, clams, and it could kill them, and if it doesn't kill them, it could make them unfit for human consumption. Populations of many forms of marine life can recover from exposure to large amounts of crude oil in warm waters with fairly rapid currents within about 3 years. But in cold and calm waters, full recovery can take decades. Recovery from exposure to refined oil could take 10 to 20 years or longer. The key to protecting the oceans is to reduce the flow of pollution from land and air and from streams. We could reduce surface water pollution from non-point sources. Most of the sources are from agriculture, as I mentioned earlier. So we could work to reduce soil erosion by keeping cropland covered with vegetation, reduce the amount of fertilizer that runs off into surface waters and leaches into aquifers. And this could be achieved by using slow release fertilizer, using no fertilizer on land that is steeply sloped, and planting buffer zones of vegetation between cultivated fields and nearby surface waters. We could use organic farming practices, which could help prevent water pollution. And we can control runoff and infiltration of manure from animal feedlots by planting buffers and locating feedlots and animal waste sites away from steeply sloped land, surface water, and flood zones. Laws can help reduce water pollution from point sources. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972, which was renamed the Clean Water Act, and the 1987 Water Quality Act form the basis of US efforts to control pollution of the surface waters in this country. And the acts set standards for the allowed levels of key water pollutants and require polluters to get permits limiting how much of various pollutants they could discharge into aquatic systems. According to the EPA, the Clean Water Act of 1972 led to numerous improvements in US water quality. Between 1992 and 2002, the percentage of US stream lengths found to be fishable and swimmable increased from 36% to 60% of those tested. The proportion of the US population served by sewage treatment plants increased from 32 to 74%, and annual wetland losses decreased by about 80%. More work can be done. So in 2006, the EPA found that 45% of the country's lakes and 40% of streams surveyed were still too polluted for swimming or fishing, and that runoff of animal waste from feedlots and meat processing facilities pollutes 7 of every 10 rivers in the US. Fish caught in more than 1,400 different waterways and more than a fourth of the nation's lakes are unsafe to eat because of high levels of pesticides, mercury, and other toxins. So then we're going to talk about sewage treatment. In urban areas, most waterborne wastes flow through a network of sewer pipes to wastewater or sewage treatment plants. The first level is primary sewage treatment. And that is a physical process that uses screens and a grit tank and then a settling tank where suspended solids settle out as sludge. So the first level of sewage treatment is removing solid materials from the sewage water. A second level is a secondary sewage treatment where a biological process takes place in which aerobic bacteria remove as much as 90% of the dissolved and biodegradable organic wastes. And those are called oxygen demanding because it requires oxygen in order to biodegrade the wastes. So if you use a combination of primary treatment and secondary treatment, it will result in the removal of about 95 to 97% of suspended solids and oxygen demanding organic wastes from sewage wastewater. 70% of most toxic metal compounds and non-persistent synthetic organic chemicals are also removed. 70% of phosphorus, 50% of nitrogen are also removed. But the treatment only removes a tiny fraction of persistent and potentially toxic organic substances found in some pesticides and in discarded medicines that people put into sewage systems. That includes when people flush medications down the toilet. That's partly what they're talking about. So it's no longer, it used to be recommended, they used to tell people like flush old medications down the toilet. Now they're saying not to do that because we know that it stays in the water, and like I just said, only a small fraction of some of the medication chemicals will get removed from the sewage water before it is released back into the local waterways, because that is what happens to treated sewage water. After it goes through the sewage treatment plant, it gets released into local waterways, rivers, bays, things like that. Also, sewage treatment does not kill all pathogens. The sewage treatment that we've discussed so far, the primary and secondary treatment, does not kill all the pathogens. So then it needs to be disinfected. So before being discharged into the local waterways, the water has to undergo bleaching to remove any coloration in the water, and disinfection, it has to undergo disinfection to kill any bacteria and some viruses. So usually the disinfection is accomplished using chlorine or chlorination. And then there are some issues related to chlorinated water. For example, chemicals formed during the chlorination process have been shown in some studies to cause cancer in test animals and may have other effects. The use of other disinfectants such as ozone and ultraviolet light is increasing, but they cost more and their effects do not last as long as those of chlorination. So then also your tap water, like by the time it comes to your tap, has also been chlorinated. And that's going to usually be by the water company. Now, if you have a well on your own property, then you most likely do not have that happening. But if you get water from your local town or city, many times they chlorinate it. So this is just a schematic showing you the primary and secondary levels to sewage treatment. So the primary, again, is the removal of physical properties, the solid waste, and the secondary treatment is going to be the bacterial decomposition. Now also you end up with this sludge at the end of the process, all the way at the bottom here, this sludge drying bed. So then that has to be disposed of somehow. So that can be put in a landfill, or in some cases, it can be applied to cropland, pasture, or rangeland. But in that case, it might be contaminated with certain toxins that have not been removed. And then this is just a list of solutions for what we could do to prevent water pollution and reduce water pollution. So you could read through this. And then also, here is a list of some videos that I have posted on Blackboard. So we have something on the NJ Vid. It's called Dirty Water Urban Runoff. Then there's a short video on microplastics. And then there is a video called Frontline Poisoned Waters. And then there is another video about the Passaic River. So you could go and watch any of these on Blackboard, but I'm actually going to show you this last one here.